Normandy, June 7th, 1944. Just after dawn, a cold mist clung to the low ground near Sword Beach, the kind that crawled up your boots and into your lungs. The air still smelled of salt and gunpowder, the storm of yesterday's invasion lingering like a bruise. British infantry moved cautiously through the hedgerows, eyes scanning the soft soil for something more dangerous than a German rifle. Mines. Lance Corporal Thomas Reed, barely 20, knelt beside a shallow depression in the earth. In his gloved hands, he held a strange device, a long, T-shaped wand connected by cable to a backpack battery. No scope, no trigger, no violence. Just a low humming and the promise it could find the invisible killers buried beneath his feet. He swept it in arcs, steady and slow, just as he'd been trained, all of 6 days ago. Each pass was a breath held. Each tone from the earphones a possible death sentence or salvation. Behind him, a dozen soldiers waited, their advance halted by the unseen that he wasn't a warrior. Not really, but in that moment, Reed held the lives of an entire squad in his hands. And all he had was this strange, humming wand. In the early years of the Second World War, the battlefield was changing. The vast open spaces of Europe and North Africa had become increasingly deadly, not just because of bullets or artillery, but because of what lay beneath the surface. Anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were transforming how war was fought. The Germans, meticulous in defense, had embraced mine warfare early. By 1940, they were laying vast belts of mines along the French coast, around key airfields, and across anticipated invasion routes. These weren't just haphazard traps, they were deliberate, strategic barriers meant to slow, break, and demoralize advancing troops. The British Army quickly learned the price of underestimating these hidden weapons. In North Africa, where mobility was key and the terrain offered little cover, minefields became one of the most potent tools the Axis powers used to shape the battlefield. Rommel's Afrika Korps, especially, used minefields not just as defensive lines but as tools to lure Allied forces into predictable kill zones. Fields laced with Teller mines and S-mines could destroy tanks, maim infantry, and bring offensives to a grinding halt. Soldiers began to refer to these death zones as Devil's Gardens. Clearing them was a nightmare. In the early war years, British engineers had no reliable detection equipment. Mines had to be located by sight, sometimes just a telltale bump in the sand, or by poking the ground gently with bayonets and long rods. It was slow, exhausting, and unimaginably dangerous work. Every inch forward meant kneeling, probing, marking, and then repeating. There were no guarantees. A missed mine could end the lives of a squad in seconds. More than once, clearing teams were lost because of a single overlooked device. The psychological toll was enormous: fear, fatigue, and the constant pressure of time. Despite this, mine warfare only escalated. As British forces prepared for offensive operations in Libya and Egypt, they encountered minefields laid in layers, sometimes 2 or 3 deep, with dummy mines thrown in to confuse. Mines weren't just a defensive obstacle anymore. They had become psychological weapons. Commanders understood this. A delayed attack wasn't just a tactical inconvenience. It could mean losing momentum, surrendering the initiative, and wasting lives. By late 1941, it was clear to British High Command that mine clearance methods needed to evolve fast. The Royal Engineers were overstretched. Training replacements was slow and attritional. Too many soldiers were being thrown into lethal roles with barely any preparation. In some sectors, mine casualties rivaled those from direct combat. What the British Army desperately needed was not just a better method of clearing mines. They needed a device. A machine that could do what human eyes and bayonets could not. Something portable, fast, and most of all, simple enough to be used by freshly trained sappers under the most stressful conditions. The solution, as it turned out, would not come from a British inventor, but from a Polish exile working in quiet obscurity behind British lines. The man's name was Józef Kosacki. Before the war, he had been an engineer and professor in Poland, working in the fields of radio and electronics. When the Germans invaded in 1939, Kosacki, like many Polish patriots, fled westward, eventually reaching the United Kingdom through Romania and France. There, under the umbrella of the Polish armed forces in exile, he continued his work, contributing to the Allied cause with technical innovations. Quiet and methodical, Kosacki possessed the rare ability to turn scientific theory into practical wartime tools. What he developed in late 1941 was deceptively simple, a portable mine detector. Unlike previous large or unreliable detection devices, this one was compact, battery-powered, and could be operated by a single soldier. It consisted of two coils, one acting as a transmitter and the other as a receiver, connected to an amplifier and headphones. When swept over the ground, the electromagnetic field would interact with buried metal objects. If it encountered a mine's metallic components, a distinct tone would sound in the user's ears. It was a clean, elegant application of electromagnetic induction, an engineer's solution to a soldier's nightmare. The British military took notice immediately. In field trials, the detector showed remarkable promise. In side-by-side tests, Kosacki's device outperformed the manual bayonet method both in speed and accuracy. Engineers could sweep sections of land in minutes rather than hours. Crucially, the detector worked even in challenging soil conditions, including the dry sands of North Africa, where traditional methods were unreliable. The design was rapidly adopted and formally named the Polish Mine Detector Mark I. Though its origin remained officially anonymous for decades, British records referred to it simply as the Polish detector. Production began quickly. British engineers adapted the design for rugged use. Improving components were necessary, but keeping Kosacki's core principles intact. By the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, the devices were already in use. British sappers deployed them during night operations to clear paths for advancing tanks and infantry. The results were immediate and measurable: fewer mine-related casualties, faster advances, and a growing trust in the new technology. For soldiers on the front, it was almost miraculous. A device that could see underground, warning them of what had previously been invisible. And, perhaps most importantly, it was simple. It didn't require months of technical training. Soldiers could be taught in days. Sweep low, steady, back and forth, listen for the signal, mark the spot, and move on. Instructors drilled these motions into every sapper's routine until it became instinctive. In time, even non-engineers, infantrymen, vehicle crews, medics were trained to use them in emergencies. The device democratized survival. You didn't need to be a seasoned engineer to clear a path anymore. Just calm, focus, and a good ear. As the war expanded from the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, so too did the importance of the mine detector. It was no longer a niche tool used in special operations. It became a standard-issue device, slung over shoulders alongside rifles and field packs. Wherever there were mines, there were now detectors. And behind them, soldiers like Lance Corporal Reed, stepping forward into danger, trusting the soft whine in their ear to guide them safely through the Earth's deadliest traps. To most infantrymen, a minefield was a nightmare. But for the men tasked with clearing them, the sappers, it was daily reality. These were not elite commandos or frontline riflemen. They were engineers with a calm mind, steady hands, and a quiet sort of bravery. Clearing mines was never a glory-filled task. There was no fanfare, no medals waiting, just the knowledge that one wrong move meant death, not only for themselves, but for the men depending on them to open a path forward. With the introduction of the Polish mine detector, the sappers' world changed, but only slightly. The terror was still there. Every mission still demanded stepping forward into the unknown. But now, in place of blind probing, they had something to trust. Many described the feeling as having a sixth sense, a kind of echo in their ears that warned them of death just below the surface. Still, mistakes happened. Batteries failed. Mines were buried too deep or constructed with minimal metal content. The detector wasn't perfect, but it was better, vastly better, than anything before it. And for the young soldiers using it, often with barely a week's experience, that mattered. Many were in their teens or early 20s, handed a metal wand, and told they were responsible for platoon safety. They moved forward while their comrades stood frozen behind them. Every step was a decision. Every tone in their headset, a spike in heart rate. And yet they walked, heads down, sweeping slow and steady because someone had it out at first glance. The Polish mine detector didn't look like much. A long wand, a cable, a backpack-sized power unit. But inside it was a marvel of wartime engineering. Not because it was complex, but because it was simple where it needed to be. The principle was electromagnetic induction. The transmitter coil created a magnetic field. If a metal object disrupted that field, the receiver coil detected it, and the amplifier sent a tone to the operator's headphones. No visual signals, no displays, just sound and the trained human ear. This minimalist design meant the device could be produced quickly, maintained easily, and taught even to men with no technical background. It wasn't fragile either. The casing was durable, the coils rugged, and the wiring could be repaired with basic tools. Most importantly, it was adaptable. British field engineers modified the original design slightly for local conditions. They improved the battery casing to endure desert heat. They changed the headset padding for comfort. They tested it against new mine types, German pressure mines, anti-personnel traps, even buried grenades wired as improvised explosives. The detector proved versatile, dependable, and fast. And its greatest strength? It allowed soldiers to act before stepping. In a war where seconds meant survival, that was revolutionary out on the battlefield. Time is everything. A stalled column invites artillery. A delayed advance lets the enemy regroup. Minefields weren't just meant to kill, they were meant to paralyze. Without a way to breach them quickly, entire divisions could grind to a halt. Before detectors, clearing a single lane through a minefield could take hours. And those hours cost lives, especially under enemy fire. But with trained detector teams, that same lane could be open in minutes. It changed the tempo of operations. Armor divisions could keep moving. Infantry could maintain pressure. Surprise could be preserved. In desert warfare especially, where battles were fought across open plains, speed meant survival. During the North African campaigns, British forces learned to pair mine detectors with flail tanks and demolition charges. The detectors would clear initial paths for vehicles, which would then widen the breach with brute force. It was a choreography of steel and instinct, and it worked. Later, in the invasions of Sicily and Normandy, detector teams often landed in the first assault waves, clearing beach exits before the main force even arrived. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Without that initial sweep, that quiet, methodical search, no tanks would roll. No infantry would advance. The battle would be lost before it began. For a commander, few things were more unnerving than advancing into unknown terrain. Mines meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant vulnerability. At the tactical level, mines could slow a battalion to a crawl. At the strategic level, they could derail entire operations. That's why the mine detector, despite being a relatively modest piece of kit, earned an outsized level of trust from military leadership. Commanders in the British Eighth Army, particularly in the North African campaigns, quickly recognized the potential. It wasn't just about safety, it was about restoring initiative. With detectors, they could order night advances across previously mined terrain. They could plan supply routes and tank movements with less fear of sudden destruction. And they could keep pressure on enemy lines without pause. General Bernard Montgomery, known for his methodical planning and attention to detail, placed great emphasis on engineering assets during the preparation for the Second Battle of El Alamein. Among those assets were the newly issued Polish mine detectors. Sapper teams equipped with them were embedded in forward units, given direct support, and tasked with opening lanes that tanks would follow within hours. Their success wasn't measured in kills, but in momentum, and leadership took notice. The detector became a tool not just of survival, but of control. It allowed officers to make decisions based on confidence rather than guesswork. And in war, that confidence often made the difference between chaos and breakthrough. The Germans were not blind to the Allies' technological advances. As early as 1942, Axis forces began noticing faster and more effective mine clearance by British and Polish units. What followed was a deadly game of adaptation. German engineers began modifying mine designs. They reduced the metal content, making them harder to detect. Some were encased in wood or glass. Others were booby-trapped, wired to explode when tampered with or when another mine was lifted nearby. In several recorded instances, fake mines were laid, scrap metal buried to trigger detectors and waste Allied time, while real mines remained hidden nearby. One particularly cruel innovation was the use of anti-lift devices. These were secondary fuses designed to detonate when a mine was moved, targeting the very men trying to disarm them. The message was clear: even if you found the mine, you might still die trying to clear it. In response, British sappers adjusted their tactics. They began sweeping wider arcs, probing multiple points, and marking mines rather than removing them immediately. Detector teams worked in pairs, one scanning, one marking, to reduce exposure. It became a contest of nerves and adaptation. The mine detector gave the Allies an edge, but the Germans were determined to blunt it. The battlefield, once dominated by tanks and artillery, now had a second war raging beneath the soil, a war of wires, coils, and cunning. There was something haunting about mine warfare. Unlike bullets or bombs, mines didn't discriminate by intention. They waited, patient and silent, for a footstep, a wheel, a careless movement. They killed long after the battle had moved on. For soldiers clearing them, this impersonal lethality left a mark. The detector helped. It gave soldiers a sense of agency, a fighting chance, but also forced them to confront just how mechanized the war had become. Victory didn't always come from heroism. Sometimes it came from an electric signal and a well-tuned ear. For civilians, the implications were worse. In towns retaken from Axis forces, mines were often left behind. Roads, gardens, even wells were booby-trapped. The detector became a lifeline for post-combat zones. British engineers used them not just in combat, but in humanitarian roles, clearing areas so civilians could return to their homes, children could walk paths again, and the war's shadow could recede. In this way, the detector was more than a tool. It was a symbol of survival in a war increasingly dominated by machines. A reminder that even in mechanized slaughter, a human hand holding a simple device could make the difference between life and death. The beaches of Normandy, June 1944, offered no mercy. For all the planning, training, and firepower the Allies had brought to Operation Overlord, the reality of landing under fire was chaos. Troops disembarked into churning surf, bullets tearing through the morning mist. Engineers, weighed down with gear and responsibilities far heavier than explosives, hit the sand with one goal: clear the way. Among them were mine detection teams. Their targets weren't enemy soldiers, but buried steel teeth, the German S-mines and Teller mines seeded into the approaches and exits from the beaches. The Germans had anticipated invasion, and though their defenses at places like Omaha and Juneau varied in strength, nearly every access point was mined with ruthless precision. On Sword Beach, where British forces landed alongside French and Canadian units, the Polish mine detectors were put to one of their greatest tests. The terrain was tight: seawalls, narrow lanes, hedgerows, all easily mined. German engineers had embedded mines in patterns, often at odd angles, buried deeper to evade standard probing. Time was critical. Troops needed to push inland to secure Cannes. Every minute lost increased the chance of counterattack. Lance Corporal Thomas Reed, like many sappers that day, had never seen actual combat before. His job wasn't to fight, but to listen. With the Polish detector slung across his shoulder, he pressed forward through the sand, scanning the path ahead of a stalled group of infantry. The machine in his hands hummed faintly. Each pass over the soil was a prayer. Moments earlier, a soldier had stepped on a mine a few meters away. The crater still smoked. Yet Reed moved forward, sweeping the wand like a metronome. Steady, measured, listening for that faint change in tone, the subtle shift that meant danger beneath. Behind him, another engineer followed, marking suspected mines with white-tipped stakes. The rest of the unit crouched low, waiting on the edge of breath. Elsewhere across the beaches, the story repeated. On Gold Beach, engineers crawled through wet sand with detectors and shears, clipping wires and disarming fuses as artillery roared overhead. At Juneau, Canadian troops relied on sappers to breach mine seawalls and clear tank lane for the 3RD Division's advance. Many of these soldiers had received only minimal training with the detectors. And yet, under fire, under pressure, they performed with a clarity that belied their inexperience. What made the difference wasn't courage alone, it was the confidence in the detector. That odd little box, humming and hissing, had become a lifeline. Unlike the frantic probing of earlier years, this was methodical. Even in the frenzy of D-Day, the detectors bought back seconds, and those seconds saved lives. As British and Allied forces pushed off the sand and into the bocage country beyond, the need for speed grew. German forces were regrouping. Roads, orchards, and even farmhouses were mined. But the engineers didn't stop. Within hours of landing, detector teams were moving inland with infantry, sweeping hedgerow lanes and village paths. Reports from the Royal Engineers during those first 48 hours are filled with terse, clinical entries. Lane cleared for devices neutralized. Sweep team completed pass, 0 casualties. Behind those lines were real men, exhausted and soaked in fear, trusting that a simple tone in their headphones would be enough to keep them alive. The Polish detector had met its moment. In the most complex amphibious assault in modern history, it had done more than function. It had enabled movement. The breach of mine exits didn't just save troops. It preserved the tempo of the invasion. In war, momentum is everything. And on those narrow beaches, momentum came not just from tanks or warships, but from the quiet, deliberate arc of a metal wand over the earth. As the Allies pushed beyond the beaches and into the French countryside, the role of mine detection evolved. The terrain changed. The open sands gave way to the thick, tangled hedgerows of Normandy's bocage. Each lane was a trap, each field a risk. Retreating German forces, aware of their dwindling hold on northern France, left behind a cruel trail of explosives. Mines weren't just laid to stall, they were laid to maim, to punish, to poison the land behind them. It was in this environment that the Polish detector truly proved its worth, not as a gadget of convenience, but as a tool of necessity. Every advance meant new roads, new towns, new crossings, and every one of them might be mined. German S-mines, dubbed bouncing Bettys, were the most feared. Buried beneath the surface, they leapt upward when triggered and exploded at waist height. One was enough to wipe out a squad. But with a skilled operator and a functioning detector, their threat could be neutralized. British engineers learned to move in rhythm with infantry. A mine detection team would lead the way, sweeping roads and paths, listening for that rising pitch in their headset. Once a field was marked, clearance teams followed, disarming or detonating devices before the main force moved through. This process became second nature. In many units, the speed of advance was directly tied to the efficiency of the sappers. In one recorded instance during the battle for Cannes, a British armored column was stalled by a suspected minefield near a railway embankment. Time was tight, German reinforcements were en route, and artillery fire was increasing. Within minutes, a detection crew was on site. Using Polish detectors, they swept a wide arc across the suspected area. In just under half an hour, they cleared a path wide enough for the lead Sherman tanks to pass through. The battalion resumed movement, flanking the German positions before nightfall. The path had been blocked, then opened, not by explosives, but by a handheld device and the men trained to trust it. Elsewhere, during the push toward the Seine, Allied forces encountered hastily rigged booby traps in abandoned farmhouses and crossroads. German engineers, short on time, had wired mines beneath floorboards, under bodies, even inside water troughs. The Polish detector wasn't perfect in such conditions. Wooden-cased mines remained elusive, but even partial detection changed the equation. Engineers could prioritize, probe more carefully, and make informed decisions. The speed at which British sappers could clear a route became a tactical asset. It allowed commanders to reroute convoys on short notice, to shift reserves during combat, and to pursue retreating enemies without risking massive losses to hidden explosives. Speed didn't just save time, it saved momentum. And in mobile warfare, momentum was everything. As the Allies crossed into Belgium and Holland, the challenges grew. Urban combat meant complex environments, basements, alleys, ruins, all perfect places for concealed explosives. Yet the detector remained relevant. In cities like Nijmegen and Arnhem, Royal Engineers swept rubble-strewn streets, while paratroopers fought from house to house. Even under sniper fire, detection teams kept working, not because they had to, but because the men behind them couldn't move without them. The Polish mine detector had started as an innovation born of exile. But by 1944, it had become a critical instrument of Allied warfare. It was the unheralded vanguard of every advance, the reason supply trucks made it to the front, the reason wounded soldiers could be evacuated along safe paths. In the chaos of war, it introduced a thread of order, a hum, a tone, a signal that the way ahead was safe. And with every sweep, every cleared lane, and every mine neutralized, it helped shift the war's momentum, not with explosions, but with silence. By the closing months of 1944, the impact of the Polish mine detector had become unmistakable. Reports from the Royal Engineers documented a sharp decline in mine-related casualties in units properly equipped and trained in its use. In the aftermath of Normandy and through the liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands, the detector had proven its worth, not just once, but repeatedly, across varied terrain and combat conditions. Statistics were sobering. In early North African operations, mine-related casualties among sapper units often exceeded 30%. But by mid-1944, with widespread deployment of detectors, that number had dropped significantly, in some cases by more than half. These were not just numbers. They represented lives saved, limbs spared, missions continued. The mine detector had become more than a tool. It was a buffer between man and machinery, between flesh and steel. The British Army responded accordingly. Training manuals were updated to include standard mine detection procedures. New engineering units were formed specifically to handle the growing demands of mine clearance in frontline and rear echelon areas. More detectors were manufactured, and the design continued to evolve. Improved models with more sensitive coils, sturdier components, and longer battery life were developed throughout 1944 and in 1945. These refinements extended the detector's usefulness into increasingly complex battlefields. The value of the device extended well beyond Western Europe. In the Italian campaign, where mountainous terrain and ruined infrastructure created deadly choke points, mine clearance was essential. Roads and bridges had been mined to stall Allied armor. Here, detectors allowed pathfinding teams to keep supply lines open and prevent ambushes on narrow passes. The simple act of sweeping a road before a convoy became routine, and it prevented untold losses. Even in the Pacific Theater, where British Commonwealth forces operated in Burma and Southeast Asia, the idea of handheld detection was being explored. Though conditions differed, with dense jungle and heavy rainfall often interfering with electronics, the fundamental concept had taken root. Future operations would rely on this foundation. Back in Britain, the engineering teams and design labs continued refining the technology. Civilian contractors were brought in to ramp up production, and training facilities expanded to keep pace with the growing demand. Polish exiles who had served in the technical corps, including those who worked directly under Józef Kosacki, were recognized, though quietly, for their contributions. The official credit for the mine detector remained anonymous for decades, due to military protocol and Kosacki's own request. But within technical and military circles, his name was known and respected. As the Allied forces approached Germany's borders, the landscape became increasingly deadly. The German military, falling back toward the Rhine, laid vast belts of mines, a desperate effort to slow the inevitable. Yet now, the Allies had a system. Detector units advanced with methodical speed. Mines were still deadly, but they were no longer paralyzing. The momentum carried from Normandy to the Siegfried Line owed much to a simple device carried by ordinary men: a wand, a hum, a path forward. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, minefields did not disappear. They remained scattered across the continent, in forests, in villages, across former battlefields, and along borders hastily defended in retreat. For the people returning home, mines were a silent enemy that outlived the war itself. That's when the Polish mine detector, originally built for soldiers, took on a new role, one grounded not in combat, but in recovery. British and Allied engineering units remained behind in many liberated areas to begin the monumental task of post-war demoning. Cities had to be cleared before civilians could return. Farmlands had to be swept before they could be tilled. Roads, riversides, and even graveyards were all littered with explosives. The same detectors used on the beaches of Normandy were now repurposed in towns like Arnhem, Caen, and Cassino, helping ensure that peace would not be followed by hidden tragedy. In total, millions of mines have been laid across Europe. The job of clearing them took years. Some remain to this day, reminders of a war that outlived itself in steel and soil. Yet thanks to the mine detector's simplicity and effectiveness, many of these mines were removed safely, thousands of lives spared in the process. The device's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. It was now a tool for reconstruction. The legacy of a mine detector did not end with the Second World War. In Korea, British Commonwealth forces again faced enemy minefields and again relied on improved detection devices based on the original Polish design. Throughout the Cold War, military engineers across NATO adapted and enhanced mine detection systems, integrating better coils, power systems, and eventually digital signal processing. But the core principle remained Kosacki's: simplicity, portability, and human-guided precision. Józef Kosacki, whose name had been kept from official record during the war, continued his work in Poland after the conflict. Though recognition came slowly, his contribution eventually received acknowledgement from military historians and engineering institutions. He had saved lives not with bullets or bombs, but with a circuit, a coil, and a refusal to let war dictate helplessness. His invention outlived him and will likely outlive many generations to come. The British Royal Engineers, for their part, adopted mine detection as a central doctrine in military engineering. New units were trained specifically in explosive ordnance disposal, using increasingly sophisticated detectors and robots, but the lineage could always be traced back to that first, elegant device born of wartime necessity. Even today, humanitarian mine clearance efforts in former conflict zones, from Cambodia to Angola to Ukraine, rely on descendants of the Polish detector. Though modern devices use ground-penetrating radar and artificial intelligence, the original idea that a person with a tool and the right training could stand between war and survival remains unchanged. The mine detector didn't win the war, but it made winning possible. It allowed armies to move, civilians to return, and nations to rebuild. Its victory wasn't marked by conquest, but by the quiet certainty that progress could continue, one safe step at a time. In the long, bitter history of warfare, most inventions are remembered for the destruction they brought. The rifle, the tank, the bomb, each became symbols of power through devastation. But the Polish mine detector was different. It was not designed to kill or conquer. It was built to protect, to guide, to preserve life in a place where life had so often been stripped away. Its genius lay not in overwhelming force, but in its quiet purpose. It was a tool that gave soldiers, often young, frightened, and far from home, a chance to survive the unseen. A way to move forward, not blindly, but with deliberate care. In a war defined by industrial brutality, the mine detector reminded the world that even the simplest technologies, when born of necessity and used with courage, could save more lives than they took. It also represented something deeper: the convergence of science and humanity in the face of chaos. Józef Kosacki, a displaced man in a foreign land, took his knowledge and gave it shape, not for glory, but because soldiers were dying needlessly. His invention didn't alter the course of the war with thunder or fire. It changed it quietly, one cleared lane at a time, one heartbeat spared. And in the decades since, as deminers have stepped cautiously into ruined fields, as engineers have swept ground long after the guns fell silent, that quiet legacy has endured. The detector became more than metal and wire. It became a symbol of what humans can build not only to fight, but to survive. That in the end, it was never just about finding mines. It was about finding a way forward, through danger, through darkness, and towards something safer beyond.